Hey guys, tonight we'll travel through a winter without fireplaces, without electricity, without downcoats, only stone, smoke, and the pale breath that cracks your lips in the freezing air. Out there, the wind howls across the bare fields. Inside a wooden hut blackened by soot, medieval folk huddle close to a small fire, listening to the heavy breath of cattle as they warm one another with shared life. There is nothing between them and death but a damp wool blanket and a dying flame. And I must be honest with you, you wouldn't survive a single day there. They endured winters when rivers froze solid, bread turned to stone, and candles were luxuries reserved for the church. Villages lay silent, buried under snow, and the only sound that moved through the white air was the tolling of church bells, each one announcing that another soul had fallen asleep forever in the cold. So, before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if the stories I tell bring you something worth keeping, and if you're listening from a place where it's snowing or even just a rainy, chilly night, tell me, where are you now? And what time is it where you are? Now then, turn off the lights, sink into your warm blanket, and let us step quietly together into tonight's journey. 3 electric blankets, a basin of boiling water, and still the cold slips beneath your skin. That's when you start to wonder, if even now I'm shivering, how on earth did people in the Middle Ages survive their winters? With no electricity, no hearths, no ginger tea, no Netflix. A question that begins in complaint soon opens into an abyss of history. A world where cold was not a season, but a fate. For several centuries, Europe lived through what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age, roughly from the 14th to the mid-19th century. But its beginning, around the year 1300, was enough to plunge millions into darkness, hunger, and trembling. Winter, then, was not merely weather. It was a vast pressure system that swallowed the world, an endless silence made visible. Imagine this. You live in northern France, or across the damp plains of England. This year, autumn arrives 10 days too soon. The leaves barely have time to turn gold before the snow falls. Grain rots in the barns, mud devours the roads, and the rare sunlight that pierces the clouds seems only to remind you that life still exists, but barely. A medieval peasant had no concept of -degrees Celsius. They only knew that when the water in the well froze, the children would soon begin dying of fevered lungs. The monks who kept records wrote with weary calm, "We have grown used to the cold as to a bad husband. He always returns, and no one can leave him." And yet, though they lived in cruelty, they did not see cold as the devil's doing, but as the hand of God. Frost was a test of faith. Those who endured without complaint were promised salvation. Some preachers even taught that cold could purify the flesh, for the flesh was the root of lust. You might freeze to death, but at least you would die pure. It was a beautiful logic if one ignored the fact that it kept thousands of poor souls from adding another log to the fire, for fear of sinning through idleness. But the cold spared no one. It crept through every rank. From the peasants hunched in earthen huts to the nobles shivering in their castles. And then came the cruelest irony. The so-called fortresses of power were colder than the fields outside. Stone held moisture, drank in frost. The windows were narrow as wounds, and the thick tapestries hung on the walls not for beauty, but to keep out the wind. In London, Paris, or Bruges, the grandest halls were vast freezers of echoing stone. People burned coal night and day, but soot coated the ceilings until even the air smelled of iron and tallow. If you lived in the 14th century, you'd understand that warmth was not a state, it was a moment. It lasted for a few heartbeats, when you stood close enough to the flame and your hands had not yet blistered. Some survived by smoke. Not because smoke gave heat, but because it deceived the senses. They breathed until their eyes stung, felt the hot sting of tears, and mistook it for comfort. Psychology had not been born, but they had already invented its first illusion. Of course, not everyone had the patience to sanctify the cold. Some turned to wine, some to prayer, some to the cowshed. To share a roof with animals was the most practical form of survival. Livestock gave off heat, raising the air inside by 5 or 7 degrees. The trouble was the air was thick with dung, fleas and the acrid stench of urine, enough to kill you slowly if the frost did not. Yet in a world where death was an old neighbour, that was a reasonable trade. Among the upper classes, winter became a theatre of power. Furs, mulled wine, candles and feasts, all were disguises for the same primal terror. The fear of cold, of hunger, of being left in darkness. Paintings from the age. Les très riches heures du Duc de Berry, les très belles heures de Notre-Dame, show a strange aching beauty. Fields buried in white, bowed figures, and a single red flame beating like a heart inside a frozen world. And perhaps the most astonishing thing is how they turned misery into rhythm. They did not outlast winter. They lived with it. They knew when to chop wood, when to dry hay, when to keep silent. They measured sunlight, listened to the cracking of ice to foresee the weather. While we warm ourselves with electricity and complain about cold feet, they warmed themselves with each other through song, prayer, and the press of another body before the lamp went out. And that in the end is where the storyteller's question, if I still feel cold now, how did they survive then, opens a door into a world both distant and familiar, a world where survival did not come from technology, but from habit, faith, and imagination. A world built of smoke, snow, wind, and human breath, blended into a single hymn of cold and endurance. For perhaps the truest warmth the medieval soul ever found was not in the fire itself, but in never letting it die. A medieval house was not built for comfort. It was built to keep you from dying, and those are two entirely different things. In 14th century Europe, where winter stretched on for half the year, home was not a refuge from nature, but an extension of it, damp, dim, and honest in its smell. Walls were mixed from clay, straw, and cow dung, a combination that modern minds might call eco-material, though to them it was simply what was at hand. In the rainy months, those walls softened into porridge. In the cold, they cracked, exhaled smoke, and sometimes grew mushrooms. The roof was thatched, warm, yes, but also a 5-star hotel for rats. The wind slipped through every gap, and people learned to live with it the way one learns to live beside a noisy neighbour, irritated but accustomed. At the centre of every house, rich or poor, was the hearth, not merely for cooking, but as proof that life still persisted. That flame was the house's single soul, where everyone gathered to eat, to mend, to tell stories, to sleep. When night fell, the one who sat farthest from the fire would wake with frost on their hair. Infants were laid beside the embers, sometimes too close. 15th century documents mention warming accidents, a delicate term for burned blankets. There were no chimneys. The smoke did not rise to heaven. It went straight into the lungs. Each morning the peasant opened the door, coughed until his ribs ached, and muttered something like, "A good day ahead." Everything, furniture, clothing, even hair, carried a thin layer of soot like shadowed velvet. But smoke, Troublesome as it was also a strange ally. It drove away insect, slowed rot, preserved meat, and blurred the edges of poverty. A smoke-filled hut could almost look poetic, if your eyes could stand the sting. Beneath the thatch, life unfolded in tight quarters. People shared their rooms with animals, not from affection, but for warmth. A cow gave off more heat than a hearth. When night came, goats, chickens, even pigs were herded indoors. A house of 10 humans might breathe alongside 8 beasts. It was warmer and louder, and thick with the smell of life itself. Sweat, smoke, wet straw, dung, and now and then, scorched milk. They lived among sounds, the wind's whistle, the groan of wood, the laboured breath of cattle, the coughing of children. The only true silence came with snowfall, and even then the faint crackle of fire never stopped. Outside raged the storm. Inside was a small, orderly chaos, where each person had a corner, perhaps a single square metre on the earthen floor. And if you asked them what privacy meant, they would answer, something for heaven. Building materials marked class as sharply as language. Peasants had mud and timber, the wealthy stone and glass. Yet, paradoxically, stone was colder than mud, and glass, rare and precious, belonged to those who froze most elegantly. Windows were covered with animal skin or oiled paper, which stiffened like bark in the frost. A dim yellow light seeped through the fat-coated surface, creating the gloom that one 15th century poet described as living inside the belly of a whale. Still, even in such hardship, there was warmth of another kind. The hearth was not only a source of heat, it was a symbol of survival, a red heart beating inside the dark. Every family had its own way of kindling fire, its own little song to wake the sleeping coals. A mother taught her child how to blow the flame without killing it, as she taught how to love without hurting. When the ashes cooled, they were not thrown away. They were used to wash clothes, clean dishes, or soothe burns. In a world of poverty, nothing was ever truly wasted, not even warmth. Perhaps what would astonish a modern soul most is their endurance. No padded coats, no wool socks from machines, no central heating, only skin, cloth, and a cloud of smoke. Their bodies adapted, their minds surrendered. Gracefully. They believed that enduring the cold made the body strong and the soul humble. Cold was not an enemy. It was a stern teacher everyone must learn from. So if you stepped into a peasant's house in the Middle Ages, you would not see poverty. You would see the art of survival. Everything had its purpose. Thatch for insulation, mud for moisture, smoke for pests, beasts for warmth, and human presence as the final proof of being human. Amid the acrid clutter, a fragile order held firm through patience and habit. And we, sitting in the 21st century, complaining when the air conditioning dips below 25 degrees, would not last a night in that house. But they, those people of smoke and mud, built the foundation of modern Europe, a civilization forged by fire, tempered by frost, and kept alive by the breath of those who never stopped trying to live one more day. If the peasants' cottages of southern Europe clung to warmth through smoke and dying embers, then farther north, where the sun showed itself for only a few hours a day, and the sea wind froze the marrow, humans had to invent a different art of survival. When winter was not a season but a condition of existence, building a house became an act of genius, and no one understood the better than the Vikings. Amid the stone, ice and moss-covered earth, the Viking longhouse rose like a great creature of turf, blending so deeply into the land that you could walk past without noticing it. It was not built to stand out, but to disappear, to trap heat and hide life from the northern wind. 10, 20, sometimes 30 meters long, its roof curved low and thick with 1/2 metre of sod, beneath which wooden ribs arched upward like the hull of a ship. For the Vikings, a house and a ship were but two versions of the same idea, a refuge adrift in a merciless world. At its heart burned the central fire pit, not a hearth, but a glowing corridor of stones embedded in the earth. By day, the flames burned bright. By night, the heated stones released their stored warmth, spreading it evenly through the room. It was a primitive but elegant technology, allowing the family to sleep in the smoke-hazed glow without suffocating. There was no chimney, only slits in the turf roof for the smoke to drift through, wide enough to breathe, narrow enough to hold the heat. The Vikings called it sky inside the house, a phrase strange but perfectly accurate. In that dim space, the only light came from the fire, a red shimmer that slid across fur, skin and eyes. The air was thick, tasting of smoke, sweat, dried meat and charred wood. If you breathed deeply, you could taste their entire world in one inhalation. The salt of the sea, the fat of the hearth, the musk of beasts and the ash of an unending flame. It was not the smell of filth, it was the smell of existence. When the wind outside could freeze a man solid within minutes, warmth came from unexpected sources. Cattle. In winter, Vikings brought cows, goats and sheep indoors to sleep beside them. The animals were penned at the far end of the hall behind a low wooden partition, their hot breath and massive bodies radiating living heat. The soft snorts, the shifting hooves, the thud of tails on the earth floor, these were the music of their nights. Humans and beasts together, breathing, enduring. A strange symbiosis, half comic, half sacred, wholly effective. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was an ecosystem. Moss grew thick on its roof, holding summer damp and winter warmth. Smoke blackened the rafters, hardening the wood and driving away insects. The doorway was low enough that anyone entering had to bow, partly from reverence, partly to keep the heat from escaping. When snow buried the walls, they crawled out through the roof without complaint. They had lived this way for generations. Life within orbited the fire like planets around a sun. The elders told sagas. Children carved wood. Men mended weapons. Women wove nets or hung fish to dry on beams above. The fire was both physical and spiritual centre. When it roared, laughter filled the hall. When it waned, silence settled, and they sat gazing at one another through the red haze, as though their souls too were burning, low and patient. To understand the Vikings, one must see that they did not fight winter, they dwelt in it. They did not banish the cold, they accepted it as the texture of life. They knew warmth was a visitor, endurance a companion, so their houses did not need to be beautiful, only durable, not bright, only smoky, not quiet, only alive with breath, human, bovine and fiery alike. The night stretched for endless hours. Snow climbed up to the roofline, turning the longhouse into a mound of earth sleeping beneath ice. Yet inside the ashes still glowed. When they lay down, they heard the wind screaming across the roof, the fire's soft crackle, the steady rhythm of each other's hearts. In that moment they knew they had survived, at least one more night, and that was the strange miracle. In a land where life itself was an accident, the Vikings turned survival into ritual, hardship into custom, and cold into holiness. The longhouse was not mere architecture. It was endurance made visible. A place where humans, animals, and fire breathed as one, kindling a small, stubborn warmth against the endless frost of the north. In those sod-roofed halls no one dreamed of comfort. They only needed the sound of crackling wood, the scent of smoke, and the slow bloom of warmth rising from the earth. That was enough. For in their world, to live did not mean to conquer the cold. It meant to smile within it. As the cities of Europe began to rise, stone replacing timber, tiled roofs replacing turf, humanity invented more refined ways to keep warm, and, inevitably, to burn itself alive. If the Norse learned to live with smoke, the medieval European learned to live with the constant possibility of fire. Inside the cramped cottages of peasants or the echoing stone halls of nobles, flame was an unruly guest, both companion and executioner. There were still no chimneys as we know them now. The smoke sought its escape through small round vents in the roof or gaps around doors. Sometimes it found a way, sometimes it didn't. One gust of wind, one falling ember, and the entire house, with all its sleeping souls, could turn to ash within minutes. The most common tool of warmth was the brazier, a small portable pan of glowing charcoal made of iron or bronze, carried from room to room. It was compact, practical, easy to hide beneath the table or a bed, and thus a small red bomb waiting to ignite. Medieval diaries are littered with tales of houses lost to fire after a single brazier was tipped over or smothered by fabric. Flame cared nothing for rank. Peasants and lords alike died in their sleep from being too warm for comfort. To avoid disaster, some turned to simpler methods, heated stones and baked bricks. The stones were laid beside the hearth until they glowed, then wrapped in linen or wool and tucked into beds for warmth. Primitive hot water bottles, heavy and treacherous, liable to scorch blankets or even explode if damp or cracked. In some places, people used loaves of hot, dry bread to warm their feet, an act of waste perhaps, but also the purest proof that warmth was worth any price. The upper classes, unwilling to sleep in smoke like peasants or Vikings, turned heat into an ornament. They carried hand warmers, small metal boxes of live coals, engraved with delicate patterns and latticed lids for breath. Nuns, noblewomen and clergymen held them through long winter masses, their fingers curling around the faint pulse of heat. In churches cold as tombs, those red glimmers trembled like secret hearts, half holy, half worldly. But warmth always carried peril. Chroniclers record cathedrals consumed in flame when a hand warmer slipped during prayer. Priests called it God's punishment, but the people saw only the danger of carrying fire beneath linen robes. Between psalms and bells, the sound of prayer sometimes merged with the sound of screaming, and forgiveness was sought not for sin, but for one's own burning hands. Fire in the Middle Ages was never just a tool, it was alive, warm but capricious, gentle but treacherous. They both worshipped and feared it. Many prayer books included invocations to the honest flame, the fire that warms without devouring, that illuminates without judging. In 14th century England, people would touch the morning ashes as a ritual, murmuring, "I have survived the night, and the fire still remains." In castles, heating was a ceremony of its own. Charcoal had to be chosen from special woods, dried for months, then mixed with ash to burn longer. Servants kept vigil by the hearth through the night, stirring the coals so they would not die. If one fell asleep and the fire went out, the punishment was to kneel in the snow until dawn. For when the flames died, the castle froze solid within hours. A royal servant's diary reads simply, "Last night, the fire failed. This morning, the basin froze upon the table. His lordship cursed for 2 hours. Fire gave warmth, but also a smell. Every heated room reeked of smoke, soot, and poison. Many never woke from their sleep, quietly suffocated by carbon fumes. They called it the soft death. A death without pain, like drifting into a dream. And so, in some corners of Europe, people came to believe that dying in smoke was a sign of divine favour, a small naive mercy to help them bear the fear of their own hearths. Still, they kept lighting the flame. There was no choice. In a world where cold could kill crops, beasts and bodies alike, fire was the only proof that humanity still belonged to the earth. They knew it might betray them at any moment. Yet each dawn they knelt beside it again, with trembling hands, as though beseeching a temperamental god who destroyed and saved in the same breath. And so, from the smoky longhouses of the Vikings to the stone chambers of medieval lords, fire remained the fragile centre of life, flickering, dangerous and beautiful in its cruelty. Amid the soot and the endless nights, people learned one truth that has never faded. No warmth exists without something to burn, for in the medieval winter cold did not kill only with snow, it killed with wind. It crept through every seam, every fold of fabric, every breath drawn too deep. Without stoves, without glass windows, there was but one defence left to humankind, to wear as many layers as possible. The principle was simple. Keep the body near its own heat, and let none escape. The innermost layer was linen, thin, clean, easy to wash, and kind to the skin. Everyone wore linen, peasants, monks, merchants, for it was soft and did not itch. Over it came wool, thick, heavy, stubbornly warm even when wet but itchy and rank with smoke. In houses where smoke had no chimney to flee, clothes quickly turned brown-black, saturated with soot and the scent of human life. The poor had no choice. They sewed coats from the hides of animals, sheep, hare, even dog, stiff when dry, sodden when damp yet still warm enough to mean survival. When snow buried the village, those rough pelts were the only shield between flesh and death. The wealthy, meanwhile, wrapped themselves in fox, marten or cat fur, soft, shining, and so luxurious it made warmth itself a symbol of power. Two people might shiver in the same wind, one in ermine, one in sheep's hide, and the law would divide them just as sharply. In 1363, King Edward III issued the sumptuary laws, forbidding commoners from wearing certain colours or noble furs. To be found dressed above one's station was to risk a fine, confiscation, or public shame in the marketplace. In that world, warmth was a privilege. A garment did not merely guard against the cold, it announced your place in the order of men. In monasteries, warmth was a different trial. Luxury was sin, yet the winters were merciless. Many monks wore 4 or 5 layers of coarse robes. Some secretly lined them with rabbit fur, excusing it as God's mercy for the weak. Through long hours of prayer, they needed only enough warmth to keep their fingers from trembling on the rosary. Farther north, where the snow lay for months, people made boots of leather stuffed with straw. Dry straw trapped heat and could be changed daily. Hands were swaddled in cloth, heads wrapped in long woolen hoods that covered the neck. Outside, only red eyes showed above the frost. They moved slowly, spoke little, for every breath became a wisp of white smoke. The cold was not just upon the skin. It entered the lungs. In castles, even nobility was not safe. Though fires blazed in great halls and thick tapestries lined the walls, the chill still slipped between the stones. They too dressed in layers, only finer. Smooth linen beneath, embroidered wool above, a cloak of white ermine over all. At banquets or ceremonies, they carried small boxes of coals to warm their hands, both practical and ostentatious. Even warmth had to look elegant. Peasant or lord all feared the cold. It was not loud like war, but slow, patient and certain. Each morning they pulled on the same damp clothes from the night before, waiting for body heat to soften the fabric again. Some nights their outer garments froze stiff as wood, and in the morning had to be beaten before wearing. Still, they wore them, for there was no other choice. The medieval mind knew the body better than we do. They understood where heat escaped, how to bind the neck, pack straw into boots, and wedge rags into every gap. In a world without fashion, every scrap of cloth was an instrument of endurance. Warmth was not a luxury, it was a craft. And when we look back, we see this truth clearly. In the winters of the Middle Ages, clothing was not merely fabric. It was a second skin. Thick, heavy, reeking of smoke, yet strong enough to keep a soul alive for one more season of frost. If the peasant's house of wood and mud was a test of endurance, then the noble's house of stone was a different kind of torment. Stone looked strong, eternal, and grand. But in a medieval winter, it was as cold as the grave. Walls a metre thick did not trap warmth. They trapped the chill. An entire castle became a single block of ice, slow to absorb the day's faint heat, and swift to return it as breathless cold by night. In the great palaces of the 13th century, Westminster among them, every method was tried to keep the frost at bay. Some chambers were fitted with glass, a rare luxury in that age, reserved only for kings. But medieval glass was not clear and bright as ours. It was cloudy, warped, and nearly as costly as gold. Still, though it dimmed the view, it kept out the wind, that invisible enemy forever threading through the cracks in the walls. It was the height of thermal technology, and only a handful in the entire realm ever felt its comfort. Farther south, where churches and monasteries were hewn from limestone, winter brought another misery. When the mountain winds descended, windows were sealed with mortar, broken brick, or dry leaves to block the draught. Stained glass existed only in the grandest cathedrals. Everywhere else, people lived in half-darkness, a kind of spiritual hibernation. The air inside thickened, damp and heavy with mould. When one stepped within, even the wind could be heard crying through the cracks, as though the building itself were lamenting. The nobles in their castles fared little better. They had more fires, more blankets, but fire only warmed what it faced. Behind you the chill still clung. Each room required its own blaze, and servants kept vigil through the night to ensure the embers did not die. Smoke, ash and grease clung to the stone walls, yet no one dared extinguish the flame. To lose it before dawn was to wake to trembling bodies and frozen breath. The poor, of course, had no stone to build with, nor glass to seal. When the wind forced its way through the gaps in timber or cracked mud, they used whatever they could find. Old paper, dry straw, torn cloth, even animal hides. In some villages, they hung cowhide over the door as a crude wind curtain. When the temperature fell, the hide would stiffen, creaking softly like a sigh. Their homes did not insulate. They merely resisted, one shudder at a time. Stone, symbol of power, monument of permanence, became, in winter, a reminder of isolation. A castle could withstand an army, but not the wind. A church could echo with prayer, yet remain hollow and cold as a tomb. In the Middle Ages, the thicker the wall, the greater the distance between human warmth and the world outside. To live within stone was to dwell in the silence of temperature, where breath turned to mist and footsteps echoed back like the ghosts of one's own presence. Thus, between a mud hut veiled in smoke and a palace built of frost, the difference was smaller than it seemed. No one was truly warm. The poor shivered in darkness, the rich shivered in echo, and all, regardless of rank, learned to listen to the sound of cold, that quiet, persistent voice that never left the winters of the Middle Ages. From those cold stone walls we look outward, to a winter that was not merely a season, but a force. Between 1350 and 1390, Europe entered what historians would later call the First Little Ice Age. The air itself seemed to carry judgment. The sun appeared rarely, the wind stripped skin, and the cold sank deep enough to ache the bones. Those winters were so long, so merciless, that they were not recorded as weather, but as survival. The great rivers, the artery of trade, froze into roads. The Rhine turned solid for 70 days, and the people of Cologne built an entire market upon it. They sold dried fish, black bread, hot wine, while beneath their feet the water slept, locked and soundless. It was a strange sight, humanity living upon the very thing that once sought to kill it. But for them, the freezing of a river was not a miracle. It was a warning. Spring might not come soon. Farther south, lands accustomed to warmth, Italy, France, Flanders, grew fragile in ways they had never known. Snow fell for months, piling over roofs, sealing roads, crushing barns under its weight. Everything went quiet except for the sharp crack of timber giving way. They told of nights when the snow fell without pause, and by morning entire villages had vanished beneath it. People were found frozen beside extinguished hearths, their homes caved in, their prayers unfinished. No one knew how many would live to see another dawn. Isolation became the truest terror. When the roads disappeared, each village became an island in a sea of ice. No messengers came, no traders, no news, only the wind and the sound of breathing inside dim houses. In the Monk's Chronicles, a phrase repeats itself again and again. We are buried in snow and in silence. A short sentence, containing a century of despair. The cold killed not only through frost but through time. Seeds rotted, harvests failed, cattle starved, collapsing where they stood. When winter stretched too far, food ran out before the sun returned. They burned what they had left. Wooden doors, holy statues, even church pews, to keep their final nights alive. The flames burned bright, but no one rejoiced. Each fire was a confession of surrender, and as always, humanity wrote. The chronicles, letters, and diaries of that age spoke of the cold as though it had a soul. This winter is longer than all others. It has the voice of demons and the breath of death. They were not exaggerating. When you hear the crack of ice beneath your feet and know it is the only bridge home, you too would write in the language of fear. Yet even then, life persisted through stubbornness. They lit fires in clay hearths, broke bread no larger than a fist, and prayed for the return of colour. Some died, some lost their minds, some kept writing for those yet to be born. Because of them, we know there were years when Europe forgot every hue but grey and white. The winters of the 14th century froze not just the land but the spirit. And yet, in that silence, endurance was born, a small flame against endless snow. So when we read of the frozen Rhine or the buried villages, we're not only reading of cold, we're reading of the will that refused to die, fragile, exhausted, but still burning beneath the ice. The people of the Middle Ages understood that to survive the cold, one could not rely on the mercy of God. One had to prepare while the earth was still warm. For them, winter did not begin with the snow, but with the first day of spring. Each time the sky brightened and the ice began to melt, they started counting the wood that would be needed for the year ahead. No one spoke of rest. Every day of sun was a day spent storing warmth for the months of darkness to come. In the villages of 14th century Europe, the most familiar sight was that of peasants splitting logs, drying them, binding them into great bundles and stacking them high in sheds. Firewood was not mere fuel, it was life itself. Whether a family survived the winter often depended on the size of its woodpile. Green wood was forbidden. It smoked too thickly and burned unevenly, so each summer they dried it in the open air until, come frost, it would catch with a soft crackle, warm and almost smokeless. In many villages there were even wood-cutting feasts, when everyone worked together, to share labour and quietly measure who had enough and who did not. But fire alone could not sustain them. Food, too, had to be sealed away before the world froze. Summer was the busiest season, cutting hay, harvesting, drying, grinding, storing. Wheat, oats and barley were parched in small kilns. Dry straw became bedding, and the coarse stalks insulated the stalls of livestock. Nothing was wasted, for winter was the season of preservation, not of growth. That phrase, written in a 13th century manuscript, was perhaps the simplest and truest philosophy of survival. Winter humbled all who met it. They learned to eat less, to make every grain last, to stretch life out of what remained. When the harvest ended, the best seeds were set aside for the next planting, for to eat them was to starve in spring. Cellars, salt barrels and earthen jars of grain became quiet treasures beneath the floor. In some regions, people dug deep pits lined with straw, filled them with turnips, carrots and onions, then sealed them with earth. When the snow buried the land, these hidden stores became banks of survival, opened only in despair. Preparation for winter was not a task of hands alone, but of a lifetime. Children were taught to tie wood, to dry meat, to read the weather in the scent of wind. The old passed down small commandments: never stack firewood on damp ground, never keep food too near a frozen wall, never forget to pray before tasting the first salted meat of the cold season. Each act carried a trace of ritual, as though labour itself were a form of bargaining with death. In monasteries, the art of preparation was stricter still. Monks kept precise tallies of bread, wine, and candle wax. Candles were not only for light, but for heat. Beeswax became a luxury dearer than gold. Many northern monasteries built celaria, airtight cellars to guard their stores. No one ate beyond his share, for a bite today is a prayer lost in January. From spring to autumn, this rhythm ruled their lives. Labour. Store. Wait. When winter came, they did nothing but endure. Men tools tell stories and pray that the stores would last until thaw. Summer belonged to the hands, winter to the heart. A long silence in which one measured how well one had prepared, not only for the cold, but for solitude. In the harsh world of the Middle Ages, preparing for winter was not a duty. It was a creed. Every stroke of the axe was a promise to the future. We will live one more season. And perhaps it was from those calloused hands, those nights spent drying wood and sealing jars of salt, that Europe learned its simplest lesson, that survival does not come from hope, but from readiness for the worst. If firewood was the breath of winter, then food was the memory of summer, preserved in salt and smoke. In the Middle Ages, the art of survival lay not in courage, but in the ability to keep food from rotting. In a world without ice boxes, without cold storage, and without any promise of when spring might return, people learned to freeze life by the only means they had: patience, invention, and ritual. Meat came first, the most precious and the most perishable. There was no notion of freshness as we know it. Slaughter was the beginning of a race against decay. People smoked pork, beef, or venison in windless huts. The smoke rose slowly, seeping into every thread of flesh, darkening it to a deep brown and leaving that sharp, acrid scent. The smell of survival. Meat hanging above the hearth was more than food. It was a sign of hope. To see it every day was to know that hunger could still be held at bay. For those rich enough to afford salt, a substance as dear as gold, salting was salvation. Each cut was rubbed carefully, layered in jars and buried under a crust of white crystals. Salt drew out moisture, silenced odour, and warded off the invisible rot of time, though no one yet knew the word bacteria. The poor with little salt to spare had to dry or soak their meat in weak brine, praying that the weather would show mercy. By midwinter they often soaked their salted meat in warm water for hours to wash away the sting of salt, a small act that meant the difference between nourishment and illness. Grain was the foundation of every meal. When harvest ended, wheat and barley were dried, ground and turned into dense loaves. Medieval bread was heavy, dark and coarse, not out of taste but out of necessity. White flour was a luxury for the noble. The poor ate black bread of rye, barley or oats, crops that endured the cold better than men. Each loaf was a vessel of time, able to last for weeks if kept dry. When the snows came and the meat was gone, bread was all that remained. So hard it had to be soaked in broth or wine before it could be bitten. Milk, which spoiled within a day, was transformed into forms that could endure. Cheese, butter, and a thick sour curd that burned the tongue but filled the stomach. In many places, cheese became the meat of winter, firm, fatty, and easily divided. Butter was pressed into wooden tubs, salted, and buried deep to escape the rats. Some churned it by hand until their fingers went numb, yet they did not stop, because in winter every spoonful of fat was a day of life. Even water demanded invention. The village well was the heart of survival, but when ice sealed its mouth they hacked at it with axes, drew what they could, or melted snow over coals. Snow was pure but barren. It lacked the minerals that sustained strength. Drink it too long and the body waned. So people brewed weak beer or warm spiced wine. Others boiled water with herbs, half for warmth, half to trick the hunger. Each cup of steam was a quiet luxury, a ritual of a life against the white death outside. The medieval world endured through meticulous repetition. Every act, drying, smoking, salting, soaking, had been performed for centuries, passed from one survivor's hands to another's. They had no written recipes, only memory and instinct. They knew by scent when meat was safe, by touch when cheese was ready, by sound when jars began to breathe. These were lessons unwritten, for those who survived the winter did not need to write them down, and those who did not survive had nothing left to say. Only after all was sealed and stored did people rest. Winter could lock the village behind walls of snow, but it could not lock away memory of sunlight, of wheat, of the months when things still grew. Each jar of salt, each loaf of bread, each wheel of cheese was a promise whispered through the dark. Spring will come again. To preserve food in the Middle Ages was to preserve hope. Because in that frozen world the scent of smoke and the taste of salt were the last reminders that humanity was still alive. In the far north, where the sun vanished for months and the wind cut like knives, people did not eat merely to live. They ate to resist nature itself. Every dish was more than sustenance. It was a weapon of endurance, the distilled memory of centuries spent negotiating with the cold. Among the Vikings and the old Scandinavians, survival was a science born of necessity, and no invention embodied that better than Skyer. The thick, sour, white curd that became the very soul of the northern winter. Skyer was neither cheese nor yogurt, but something suspended between the two. just like the people who made it, half farmers, half warriors. Fresh milk was gently heated, mixed with a culture or a spoonful of an older skyer, and left to ferment in its own time. The result was dense and snow-white, with a sharp acidity and an astonishing richness of fat and protein. It could last for weeks, even months, in the cold cellars without spoiling. In a land where hunger could kill within days, skyr was white gold. Breakfast, supper, and medicine all at once. Even the watery byproduct of its making, the whey, was never wasted. To throw away anything edible, drinkable, or burnable was unthinkable. The whey, sour and faintly acidic, became a perfect preservative. It was poured into barrels with salt, and into it went pork, fish, even entrails. Each cask was a kind of natural alchemy, where mild acid kept decay at bay and softened the fibres of meat. When winter arrived, opening a barrel meant releasing a sharp, pungent odour that would drive strangers from the door. But to those who lived there, it was the scent of survival. Sometimes the Vikings fermented dozens of such barrels at once, each capable of holding 50 litres of liquid. The cloudy brown mixture that simmered faintly in the dark was their chemical of endurance, not listed in any medical text, yet found in every home. It formed the base of old dishes, sour meat stews, pickled fish, or lightly fermented drinks. Whenever a barrel was opened, that sour vapour mingled with smoke, fur, and sweat, the biological perfume of the north. To visitors from the south, this diet was horrifying. A 14th century German merchant wrote, "Those of the cold lands eat rotten flesh and drink dead milk." He was not wrong, only blind to the wisdom behind it. For in a place where snow fell from October to April, where nothing grew, every drop of milk was a stored fragment of lost sunlight. Yet this harsh cuisine had its order. Skyr was ranked by age. The new was soft and mild, the old dense and piercingly sour. There was even a black skyr left for months until it hardened into near cheese. It was eaten with barley or honey, and on great feast days with powdered berries from the last summer. The whey, once finished preserving meat, was filtered, diluted with water, and drunk like weak beer, warmth disguised as drink. In this way, the North turned deprivation into discipline and severity into flavour. There was no notion of delicious or disgusting, only of living or starving. And in that truth lay their philosophy. Food need not be beautiful, only real. They did not fear sourness, smoke, or decay, for these were the scents of work, endurance, and summer kept alive inside wood and salt. So when one looks upon those 50-litre barrels of fermenting liquid, one should not laugh. Each was a vessel of hard-won knowledge, how to save every drop of milk, every scrap of meat, every brief hour of warmth. Medieval Nordic cuisine was never romantic, but it whispered the oldest lesson of all, that survival belongs not to the rich, but to those who understand hunger, and perhaps, in that endless winter, amid the sourness, the smoke, and the snow, the Vikings discovered something the rest of Europe had not yet learned, that food, however crude or strange, is nothing less than the memory of endurance. There was no winter more dreadful than the winters of 1315 to 1317, when all of Europe sank into hunger, mud, and despair. Chroniclers would later call it the Great Famine, but to those who lived through it, it was no mere historical event. It was a season of hell that lasted 3 long years, when rain never ceased, mud rose to the knees, and the sky hung low and grey, like a soaked shroud smothering the last warmth of hope. It began with what seemed an ordinary summer. Then the clouds gathered, thick, unbroken, endless. The rain fell as if the heavens had turned against the earth. Day after day, the downpour continued, drowning the fields, rotting the soil, washing away the seed. Without sunlight, the grain refused to ripen. The crops stood green and empty until they fell. The harvest failed. The granaries thinned. The fields turned to swamps. Cattle, horses, sheep, the peasants' most precious wealth, began to collapse in the mire, dying of cold and sickness. Rotten hay, mouldy straw, there was nothing left to feed them. Reports from northern France and Flanders recorded bleakly, not one living cow remains in the village. Hunger came swiftly, but death came slow, and that was the true horror. When the food was gone, people ate what the earth still offered. Bark, roots, weeds, even the seed grain meant for spring. Bread was mixed with powdered bark or crushed straw, so hard it broke teeth. Some ate the flesh of dead horses, of dogs, cats, even the carcasses that drifted downriver. In parts of Germany and England, darker whispers spread. Graves disturbed, corpses taken. Records tell of beggars murdered and boiled, a sin so great that priests dared not name it in prayer, though all knew it had happened. No one was strong enough to resist or rebuild. Monasteries overflowed with the starving, but the stores of the church were empty too. Priests grew skeletal, penitents collapsed mid-prayer. In the towns, the price of grain rose tenfold. People traded their children, their wives, their very lives for a single loaf. Mothers abandoned infants at the gates of abbeys, hoping for mercy, but the doors stayed shut. Even compassion had starved. The historian John Hatcher wrote that even the rich trembled. They had gold, but nothing to buy. Hunger spared no class. It gnawed the same bones, hollowed the same eyes. Many died not of cold or plague, but from the shock of eating too quickly when food returned. Between 1 and 3 million perished, a staggering toll for that age, equal to tens of millions today. Yet the greater terror was not death itself, but the thought that the next season would be the same, that the rain would never stop. Monks at the Benedictine Abbey of St. Albans recorded, "The sun seemed devoured, and God turned his face from mankind." In their despair, people blamed witches, cursed the stars, and scourged their own flesh for forgiveness. But no prayer pierced the clouds. The summer of 1316 brought more rain. Autumn, still rain. When winter came, the fields froze solid, sealing beneath them what little life remained. At night the church bells still rang, no longer to call the faithful, but to count the dead. Corpses were laid in drainage ditches, for the ground was too hard and the living too weak to dig graves. Rivers carried both timber and carcasses downstream, merging death and rain. In some villages, people raised crosses made of cattle bone, grim monuments that read, "He who fails to prepare, even God will not save." When at last the rain broke in 1317, there were no hands left to till the soil. An entire generation had been taken. And in the silence that followed, mankind understood a new truth. They were no longer masters of the earth, but servants of the sky. So when the Black Death came years later, many did not fear it. Famine had already taught them how to look death in the face and keep breathing. History remembers it as the Great Famine, but in folk memory it bore another name, the 3 years without the sun, a time when the sky was soaked with water, the land with mud, and the human heart with despair. Yet even in that darkness, a faint light remained. For those who survived learned the oldest lesson of all, that God does not always save, but people can, with a piece of bread, a spark of fire, and a whispered prayer in the long wet night. When the fields slept beneath their quilt of snow and the plough hung silent upon the wall, winter in the Middle Ages became an endless pause. a stretch of time too still, too long, too human. No sowing, no reaping, no hooves striking mud. All movement ceased, and those who had lived by the rhythm of seasons now faced the one thing they feared most: idle time. In the villages, daylight brought nothing but wind and smoke, but when night descended, the hearth became the centre of the universe. People gathered around the coals not only to stay warm, but to keep the silence from swallowing them. Stories were told and retold, of saints and demons, of wars and wolves, or simply of a neighbour who once saw strange lights in the forest. The storyteller was the living archive of the community. Each voice carried the weight of ritual. Speech itself became a kind of warmth. Children had their own kingdom of games. When snow thickened, they hurled it at one another or glided across frozen ponds on bones, polished smooth and tied to their feet with twine. No skates, no iron, just laughter moving through the cold air like sparks. Some of these moments survive in illuminated manuscripts, the books of hours, where noble patrons commissioned painters to capture peasant children, red-cheeked and wild-haired, throwing snow in courtyards, a brief defiance of death's season. Adults sought slower comforts. Women spun and wove, mended and patched, acts both practical and meditative. The clatter of the shuttle through thread blended with the moan of wind, forming a rhythm steady enough to soothe the heart. Men played chess, dice, or cards carved from wood. In taverns dimly lit by a single candle, they wagered ale or bread. Small, perilous luxuries. To lose meant hunger, yet they played on, because humanity needs the illusion of luck to survive the truth of winter. Music, too, held its place. There were no viols, no silver flutes, only rough voices rising in the smoke. Some songs told of love, some were lullabies, and some were meaningless refrains, chants to keep the mind from falling silent. On the longest nights, when the wind howled against the rafters and the smoke circled low, that sound was proof that they were still human. In the north, the Vikings and their descendants made winter an adversary to jest with. They turned the boar hunt into ritual and sport, a contest of endurance disguised as celebration. Each hunt began with the sound of a horn and ended in feasting. To bring down a beast was to prove not dominance, but survival. Snow whirled, mead poured, torches burned bright against the black forest. For one night, winter seemed almost conquered. Even within monasteries, those islands of prayer and restraint, laughter found a way. Monks told quiet jokes or challenged each other with riddles from scripture. Beneath the hoods and solemn vows, they were still men. They too needed to laugh, if only to silence the echo of the wind against stone. Such joys, though small, were not luxuries. They were spiritual survival. Winter numbed not just the flesh but the will. Without song, without story, without play, a soul could petrify. So every pastime, every sound of dice or loom or voice, was a form of resistance, a way to keep the inner fire alive before the hearth turned cold. In the medieval world, entertainment was never about pleasure. It was a shield for the mind. The tales around the hearth, the dice rolling on tavern tables, the shuttles whisper in the cottage corner, all were the faint heartbeats of endurance. And if one walked through a European village in the winter of 1350 and heard a song carried by the wind, they would understand. It was not music, it was defiance. When winter stretched so long that people forgot the scent of warm earth, medieval men and women turned to games as another form of fire, one that burned not in the hearth, but in the mind. In the smoke-hung cottages and the echoing stone halls of castles, play became the only movement left in a frozen world. It needed little: a few dice, a chessboard, a half-finished piece of embroidery. Small rituals through which the weary soul could find a rhythm to wait for spring. Games of thought. Chess and backgammon belong to monks and nobles, those with time enough to ponder and fires enough to keep the ink from freezing. Chess, born from the East, was called the game of the universe, the king as soul, the queen as power, the bishop as faith, the knight as nobility, the pawn as labour. Each match was a miniature world, a mirror of hierarchy. Yet here, even the lowliest could strike down a king. Lonely counts, bored ladies trapped in endless winter, would sit for hours before the board, sighing not for the loss of a piece, but for the quiet defeat of their own sadness. Dice, however, belonged to another world, the world of soldiers, peasants, and drunkards. It was the game of those who had nothing to lose. The clatter of bones on wood, laughter breaking into curses, sometimes filled the night from dusk till dawn. The church despised it, calling it the devil's game, for it made men believe in chance rather than providence. Yet the dice still rolled. Perhaps because in a world ruled by famine and frost, people needed permission to believe that fortune might change with a single toss of the hand. Even outdoors, play continued as rebellion against the cold. When snow buried the fields, children and adults alike hurled snowballs, chased one another across ice, and skated on frozen ponds using bones polished smooth and tied to their feet. They fell, they cracked the ice, they laughed. And somehow those fleeting joys found their way into sacred art, painted into the margins of books of hours, those illuminated prayer books of the 15th century elite. There, beside saints and angels, one sees children rolling snow, lovers gliding hand in hand, dogs bounding after white spheres of joy. A little world of warmth hidden between lines of devotion. Perhaps the monks who copied those pages could not resist either. Their hands wrote prayers, but their eyes strayed to the painted margins, to imagined sunlight, to laughter preserved in ink. Those faint brown and gold miniatures still whisper across centuries. Even those who believed in heaven needed a little earthbound joy to survive their winter of faith. In monasteries, games became exercises of discipline. The brothers played chess, composed Latin verses, or tested each other's memory with biblical riddles. They did not laugh aloud, yet a clever answer could warm the lips in that cold silence of stone and wax. Meanwhile, outside, in the smoky taverns of the villages, the common folk sang bawdy songs, told tales, and traded crude poems for ale. Two worlds apart, one holy, one profane, yet both searching for the same fragile proof of life. Still, joy was never innocent. In the harsh age of the Little Ice Age, every moment of play cost something: sweat, firewood, or bread. A carved wooden chessboard might cost a month's wages. A night of singing might empty half a jug of mead dearer than medicine. But people still played, still sang, because joy was not luxury, it was endurance. Winter made humanity small, but also ingenious. Games were not made to kill time, but to defy it. When the world froze, games moved. When silence grew heavy, the roll of dice, the hum of voices, proved that the human heart refused to still, and so, through the longest nights of the 14th century, amid dim firelight and clouds of white breath, these small arts of play continued, without audience, without reward. Because in a land where snow covered everything and time seemed to sleep, a game of chess, a melody, or a single snowball thrown into the dark could still be a prayer. In the medieval world, where a single breath of cold wind could steal a life, knowledge of how to survive winter was treasured as dearly as faith itself. In an age when men believed every whim of nature to be the will of God, the quiet art of understanding the body, the cold, and the delicate balance between endurance and surrender was a rare kind of wisdom. From distant monasteries to damp stone palaces, people passed from hand to hand small books, part medicine, part philosophy, part confession of the human will to live. And among them, none was more revered than the Secretum Secretorum, the secret of secrets. It was said to be the collected counsel of Aristotle written for Alexander the Great, teachings on how to rule wisely, live well, and walk in harmony with nature. But in medieval Europe it became something else entirely, a secular scripture for surviving winter. Within monasteries, monks copied it in careful black ink upon vellum, bound it in leather with iron clasps, as though wisdom itself might escape if left unguarded. Between discourses on the soul and the humours of the body, it offered advice so simple it almost sounded absurd. Avoid bloodletting, avoid intercourse, avoid purgatives during winter. Strange words, yet perfectly logical to them. Medieval medicine taught that the body was composed of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Disease was imbalance. Winter, they said, was the season of cold and damp, the time when blood withdrew, spirits weakened, and the inner fire dimmed. Thus, to bleed a man in winter, a common remedy in warmer months, was considered folly. He who does so, wrote a Parisian monk, will cause his heart to tremble, his liver to dry, and his soul to cool. Abstinence too had its logic. It was not mere moral restraint, but thermal economy. Desire, they believed, consumed heat, and heat was life. One manuscript advised, "Let a man keep the fire within him. Do not let it fade for pleasure's sake." To the medieval physician, the body was a hearth, and passion a draught that stole its warmth. Health and holiness intertwined. To preserve one's heat was to preserve one's soul. Even purging was forbidden, not because they rejected cleansing, but because expelling anything in winter was seen as defying nature itself. The body was to hold fast, as the earth held her seed beneath the frost. Keep within as the ground keeps grain, the text urged. To endure the cold, one must eat foods of warm temperament. Pigeons, game, garlic, onions, red wine, not luxuries but talismans. The closing counsel was simple, almost tender. Eat more in winter, for the body labours harder to digest in the cold. Behind that advice lay a quiet philosophy, that survival was not conquest, but adjustment. In a world without heated rooms or steaming cups, every slice of fat, every sip of spiced wine was not indulgence but wisdom. In that age, medicine and faith were never separate. A physician was a kind of preacher. A dietary rule could be a sermon. Eat modestly, sleep by the sun, pray often. 3 rules said to prolong life. Those who endured many winters were not always the strongest, but those who listened best, to their own breath, to the earth, to restraint. What is most remarkable is that such teachings did not stay within stone halls. They trickled down through sermons and stories, through whispered instruction by the hearth. A poor mother in Flanders knew that fat meat wards off the cold. An old man in Saxony swore that red wine keeps the soul warm. For a brief moment in history, knowledge, usually chained to power, became communal, carried on the breath of survival. Thus, winter in the Middle Ages was not only a trial of the flesh, but a test of the mind. Men could not command the weather, but they could learn to live within its rule. And so, books like the Secretum Secretorum, half science, half superstition, stand as proof of something enduring. humanity's endless desire not to defeat nature, but to understand it well enough to suffer wisely. In the darkness of a long frozen night, perhaps the truest image is not of a fire, but of a figure hunched beside one, turning the pages of a worn leather-bound book, reading by flickering light, trembling but smiling, knowing that knowledge, like warmth, is the one fire that never truly goes out. When speaking of winter in medieval Europe, it is almost impossible to draw a single picture. For the cold of the north was not the cold of the south, and neither did men face it in the same way. Between the snow-shrouded lands of Scandinavia and the gentler plains of Italy or Spain stretched two parallel worlds, one that had learned to live with snow and one that merely endured it. In the north, where the sun rose only to vanish behind blackened trees, winter was not a season but a state of being. People were born, married, and buried in the cold. For generations they had accepted frost as an extension of themselves, meeting it with a quiet practicality. Houses were built low and thick-walled, roofed with sod or moss to trap warmth. They wrapped themselves in layers of wool, bound their hands and feet in furs, and slept together in shared rooms where breath turned to mist and mingled in the dark. Across the white crust of snow, northerners moved as if gliding over time itself. They made skates from animal bones hunted in the ice, kindled flame from wet wood. Their winter games, snowball fights, skating, sled races, were not mere amusement but training for survival. To them, winter was not the enemy. It was a stern teacher. Those who passed its trials emerged stronger, wiser, and bound more closely to one another. In the south, where sunlight was thought to be God's habitual gift, winter arrived as an uninvited guest. When the Little Ice Age crept downward in the 14th century, Italians, southern Frenchmen, and Spaniards met a cold they had never known. Their homes, all stone and brick, were built to deflect heat, not to preserve it. Large windows lacked glass, only thin draperies. High vaulted ceilings swallowed every trace of warmth. When the first snow fell on Florence, a diarist wrote, "God is testing our hearts with ice." Southerners had no custom of wearing thick pelts. To don fox or sable was once a mark of arrogance, unsuited to God's temperate lands. But when the frost deepened, they burned whatever would burn: firewood, straw, even furniture. Records tell of a monastery in Avignon where friars, desperate for heat, fed old manuscripts to the flames. It was the irony of the South. In the land where knowledge once burned brightest, learning itself was sacrificed to survival. The cold shaped minds as much as bodies. Northerners were stoic, patient, accepting frost as a test of faith. If God sends snow, then snow we shall have, they said. Southerners, by contrast, saw it as punishment, a reminder that nature still ruled mankind. In Italian church frescoes, snow appeared as the emblem of isolation, of frozen souls. Yet in northern art it was the blank canvas beneath dances, games, and funerals alike. Even in food the divide persisted. The north lived on fat meats, dense cheeses, and heavy stews, sustenance for sunless days. The south kept to vegetables, olive oil, and wine. But as winters worsened, southern delicacies lost their virtue. Greens wilted, olives froze, and wine failed to warm. A Venetian merchant wrote in 1348, "I once mocked the northerners for eating fat. Now I crave it more than gold." The Little Ice Age carved these contrasts deeper. In northern pulpits, sermons spoke of endurance, the strength of silence, salvation through hardship. In the south, priest prayed for mercy, begging God to return the light and warmth. One Christ, two tongues, one spoke in patience, the other in pleading. Over time, adaptation itself became identity. The North learned to store, to plan, to turn ice into advantage. The South learned to wait, to hope, to trust that spring would return. Europe thus became two halves of one soul, one stoic, one lyrical, one who saw frost as destiny, the other as warning. An old saying captured it perfectly. The North accepts winter as part of itself. The South receives it as punishment. It was not only about weather, but about philosophy. To one, winter was an enemy to master. To the other, a guest to endure. Yet in the end, both lived on. Both lit their fires, both trembled, both prayed. In a Europe where the true cold came not only from the wind, but from the quiet distance that lay between human hearts. In the low, smoke-choked houses where men and beasts slept side by side for warmth, winter carried more than cold. It carried disease. The air was thick and sour, the windows sealed with rags, soot clinging to every surface. A single cough could make an entire household tremble, for all knew that if one fell ill, the rest might not live to see spring. In that world, the distance between life and death was no wider than the breath above a fading fire. There was nothing more terrifying than falling sick in the dead of winter. No doctors, no hospitals, only monks, prayers, and bundles of herbs that smelled of heaven. But sometimes even heaven kept silent. A chill could turn to fever, a scratch to rot, and death would come as gently as snow. People believed the cold air itself carried the souls of sickness. Miasma, they called it, the invisible breath of corruption. So they burned incense, hung garlic, scattered aromatic leaves, and prayed to drive away the breath of the devil. In village cottages, where livestock crowded beside their masters, the byre and the bedchamber were divided by nothing but a plank wall. Manure, straw, and smoke mingled into a smell so constant that no one noticed it anymore, except the parasites. Fleas, lice, and rats nested in the straw, crawled into clothing and onto skin. No one yet knew that from such filth, within a few decades the Black Death would rise and devour half the continent. Even before the plague, winter bred its own slow tormentors: cough, fever, pneumonia, exhaustion. The cold was an invisible killer fought only with brandy and belief. When a child's breathing grew ragged, a mother would lay her hand on its brow and whisper, "Holy Mary, let this breath live till spring." In some years, half the village might perish, not from war but from the weight of cold and closed air. The monasteries thought to be havens fared little better. The brothers lived behind damp stone, slept on straw, ate thin broth, and prayed through the chill. The air never moved. The walls sweated. Sickness spread faster than scripture. In one faded chronicle, a line trails off mid-sentence. "My brothers cough blood and cannot sing the psalm." They took it as God's trial, but it was only their lungs rotting slowly in the frost. Even the nobility could not escape. Their palaces, vast and echoing, were as cold as tombs. The wind crept through every hall, snuffing candles and freezing wine in its cups. They wore ermine and mink, yet still shivered through banquets. The tapestries glittered with gold, but not a single door was tight. A Norman count once wrote, "I can endure war, but not the cold within my bones." In those letters, pride melted into fear, the old terror of mankind before the elements. Medicine was powerless. Physicians bled their patients, wrapped them in poultices, or held them over glowing coals to drive out the chill. Those who survived did so by luck or stubborn flesh. Death was no longer an enemy, but an old acquaintance. Each winter graves opened and froze again. Each year the bells tolled through fog, and still the frost returned. In illuminated manuscripts winter was drawn as a mute god draped in white, bearing a scythe of ice. He killed not by sword, but by stillness. The trees stopped breathing, rivers turned to stone, and humankind curled in upon itself, trembling in the hush. In that silence, everything became fragile. A misted window meant life, a cold hearth, death. Thus, the medieval winter was not only a test of flesh, but a meditation on existence itself. It forced men to accept that they never truly ruled anything, not their bodies, not their homes, not even the air they breathed. They could build walls, kindle fire, whisper prayers, and yet remain small within a world of damp, darkness, and decay. A hymn from the 14th century pleaded softly, "O Lord, warm our souls, for our bodies have long been cold." It was not only the prayer of faith, but of instinct, for in the darkest months of the year, when all things stood still, the medieval mind understood one eternal truth. Between life and rot lies only a single breath, and if that breath remains, it is a miracle. In the heart of a medieval winter, the cold did not simply slip through the window, it divided mankind. Each gust of wind was a reminder that warmth itself was a privilege. While nobles sat beside bronze-rimmed hearths, sipping warm red wine beneath cloaks of fur, only a few miles away peasants trembled beside dying embers, wrapped in smoke and mud. Cold, which seemed impartial, revealed itself as the cruelest measure of class. Inside the castles the fire never died. Logs were cut all year, wine simmered in silver pots, and stone floors were softened by rugs so bare feet would not freeze. Lords wore cloaks lined with ermine. Ladies swathed their heads in silk scarves and woolen veils. They gathered around ornate fireplaces where the smoke escaped cleanly through tall chimneys. Yet even there, the chill crept through the walls. Records tell that even King Edward III slept with a stone heated and wrapped in cloth, the 14th century's most elegant hot water bottle. Beyond the gates, peasants fought the same winter with poorer weapons. Their houses had no glass, only small smoke holes. The wind slipped through straw and patched cloth. Fires were built in the centre of the room so the smoke could coil beneath the roof, burning the eyes, blackening the beams, but serving as the only blanket they owned. Many families lived with their cattle, goats and pigs, not from affection, but for warmth. Children slept to the sound of animal breathing. Adults woke each dawn to damp air, soot, and the taste of ash. The nobility ate white bread and drank wine, the poor barley porridge and weak ale. But in winter, that distance became brutally visible. Feasts in the hall offered venison, cheese, and spiced wine. In the fields, families boiled bark and ground weeds to stay alive. The frozen ground refused to yield, crops withered, beasts grew sick. Those with granaries endured, those without simply vanished into silence. Between these worlds stood the church, the supposed heart of the community, as cold as its stone. High walls, vaulted roofs, marble floors, beautiful, but they devoured every breath of warmth. Priests said mass in numb-fingered agony, hands too stiff to hold the host. One record notes, "The father dropped the bread upon the floor and wept, for his hands had lost their life." In remote parishes, villagers brought blankets to church, not for devotion, but because it was the only place with fire. To the church, cold was a form of grace. It was not only punishment, but purification. God wishes us to feel the frailty of flesh, preached the friars. Many monasteries refused to heat their halls, believing that endurance cleansed the soul. On snowy nights, monks sang hymns in clouds of breath, certain that their trembling was a prayer. But outside, the peasants who heard those hymns felt no holiness, only distance. For them, the cold was not symbolic. It was survival's edge. Thus medieval Europe was never warmed equally. The fire of the rich was a symbol of power, the ash of the poor a symbol of resignation. For nobles, heat was comfort, for peasants, existence. To one, the hearth was decoration, to the other, salvation. And between them stood the church, silent witness to a suffering that few dared name. The cold killed not only through frost, but through division. Villagers said that winter was crueler than war, for it chooses no side. But in truth, it did choose. It punished the poor, tested the rich, and exposed the souls of all. Where mud, smoke and blood met, even a small flame could redefine hope. So when winter blanketed the plains, 3 visions appeared side by side. In the castle, fire flaring bright upon stone. In the hut, thick smoke curling like a shroud. In the church, a wavering candle between frozen breaths. 3 classes, 3 worlds, 3 ways to resist one unseen enemy. Yet one thing united them all. When night fell, whether count or peasant, each curled into the dark, trembling, whispering the same prayer to see the morning still alive. If you wish to know what a medieval winter truly felt like, do not picture only snow and wind. Try to imagine the smell. For in that age, the cold did not merely make people shiver, it made the world heavy, damp and rank, sealing every odour inside. When wooden houses were sealed tight to keep in warmth, the smoke had nowhere to go. It lingered in the air, clinging to hair, blankets and skin, soaking into everything. That smoke, mingled with the scents of wet wool, sweat, animal fat and fermenting ale, formed a strange living perfume, half life, half decay, and so familiar that no one noticed it anymore. A 14th century traveller once wrote, "In winter, every house smells like a feast that has been dead for 3 days." Wool, the most common fabric of warmth, played its part in this symphony of scent. When damp, it gave off a musky, saline odour, almost animal in nature. People wore it all winter, slept in it, ate in it, and dried it by the fire where the smoke deepened its smell. A woolen cloak was not merely clothing, it was a diary of touch, steeped in the sweat of its wearer, the breath of the home, and the grease of rare, precious meals. The livestock that shared the house completed the portrait. When man and beast lived side by side for heat, the smell of hay, manure, and the sour, rum-laden breath of cattle and pigs filled the air. It was suffocating, yet alive. The smell of existence itself. A house with the smell was a house with people, with fire, with life. The odour clung to everything, to coats, to songs, even to the prayers whispered beside the hearth. And then there was the smell of fat. Animal tallow served for cooking, for ointment, for candles, even for sealing cracks in the walls. When burned, the candles cast a warm yellow glow, but their smoke was thick and acrid, the scent of food and flesh combined. In the diary of a Flemish nun, she wrote, "The room is filled with the smell of burning wax and sweat. I think if angels came down here, the smoke would drive them away." Even the monasteries smelled little better. Though cleaner and more disciplined, their damp stone walls trapped the breath of men and the fumes of incense. When dozens of monks chanted in one closed hall, the cold breath, candle wax and sacred smoke mingled into the dense air of holiness and decay, the scent of faith, endurance, and the body restrained within stone. Fermenting wine brought its own note, sweet, sharp, and sour. People brewed it in their kitchens in wooden barrels that leaked dark stains across the floor. When opened, the vapour rose to mingle with smoke, thick enough to sway the senses. Yet to the medieval mind, that scent meant comfort. A cup of warm wine could make one forget the cold, forget hunger, even forget death waiting outside the door. For there was no warm water, and bathing almost vanished through the winter months. The rivers froze. The wells could stop a heart with their chill. People wiped their faces with damp cloths or scrubbed their skin with ash. The smell of the body was not shameful. It was proof of survival. A peasant might stink, but he was alive. Cleanliness too often belonged to the newly buried. In the towns, when the thaw came and the snow turned to mud, the city itself began to breathe. The stench of drains, carcasses, fresh bread and human sweat blended in the air. Chroniclers called it the smell of God and the devil together. It was no exaggeration. In a world without soap, sewers or hot water, smell was how you knew where you stood in creation. A child was born knowing the smell of smoke, grew up beneath the smell of wool, and died surrounded by wax and sweat. Thus, winter was not only cold, it had a fragrance, a memory carried by the nose. No one wished to admit it, yet those smells were what made people feel alive. If you were to stand in a medieval house and breathe deeply, you would find it there. The scent of hardship, endurance, kinship, beasts, and fire. The smell of a world without warmth, yet full of life. It was not pleasant, but it was true. For perhaps to the medieval soul, surviving the winter meant more than keeping the body warm. It meant learning to live with one's own smell, the human scent of existence beneath the endless cold and the slow passing of time. When winter stretched so long that the sun seemed to forget the way back, time itself began to slow in the Middle Ages. The bustle of seasons was gone. No clanging of forges, no hooves on stone, no axes in the woods. Only darkness thick as cloth draped over everything, and beneath it, people learned to live slowly, to live in repetition, to live by the small rhythm of breath and habit. Winter days did not pass by hours, but by the ringing of church bells. Each chime was a notch in the silence, a heartbeat of the world. When the morning bell tolled, fires were kindled. At noon, cold porridge was eaten. At dusk, prayers were murmured, and people went to bed early to save candles. Between one bell and the next, no one hurried. Life moved in a simple cycle. Sleep, mend, tell, eat, pray, sleep, for the cold made bodies heavy. Medieval folk slept more than we imagine, not in one long stretch, but in many brief, broken rests. They woke when the fire died, added wood, whispered in the dark. Sometimes they spoke of crops, sometimes of souls, small talks to befriend the night. When the flames rose again, they returned to their straw beds, burrowed in, and slept until the morning bell called once more. Mend, for winter was the season of repair. Men patched shoes, sharpened sickles, carved new handles for tools. Women sewed torn tunics, knitted stockings, wove cloth. Their hands cracked and reddened, yet no one complained. Working slowly, evenly, while the wind hissed over the roof, made the days less cruel. Cold was not only endured, it was woven into every motion. Tell, for when the sun slept, stories became the only light left. The old spoke of the year snow buried the doors, of wolves in the village, or of saints who saved them from hunger. Children curled tight, eyes bright in the dark. Stories were not told to pass the time, but to keep silence from devouring them. It was how people kept warm with words. Eat, for hunger was the uninvited guest of every winter. Each meal was small, careful, almost ceremonial. dry bread, hard cheese, salted meat, thin broth, all divided slowly, reverently, as if afraid to use too much. They ate not only to live, but to forget the cold. In the smoky dimness, the scent of boiling gruel rose like comfort itself, proof that there was still life, still fire, still hope. And pray, the last act before sleep, the first before dawn. Not everyone believed God was listening, but everyone prayed. Let this winter be kinder than the last. Let the child's cough cease. Let the hearth not die. Amid the frost, prayer was the only spiritual warmth, the one way to speak to the fear that had no name. Wintertime did not flow, it dripped, like resin frozen inside a tree. Days passed without trace. People lived in a quiet circle. Mend, tell, eat, pray, sleep again. All things repeated, and that repetition kept them alive. For when the outer world lay buried under snow, this small rhythm within was the last proof of endurance. If one stepped outside in mid-January, the village would appear ghost-like, white, still, and voiceless. Only the church bell rang, distant and cold, drifting across the fields, touching every roof before fading away. In that sound one understood. Winter was not the season of death, but the season when time stopped, so that mankind might learn to wait for light, for warmth, for the first rooster's cry of spring. And when that moment finally came, when the sun broke faintly through the grey, people did not cheer. They simply bowed their heads, for they had lived through another cycle, another silence, another stretch of time when the world seemed asleep forever. In history, the medieval winter was more than a trial of weather. It was a lesson in patience. For in the longest darkness, humanity found its own quiet rhythm, slow, small, but never extinguished. When winter finally ended, no one truly knew the day it had begun, nor the day it was gone. Only that one morning ice melted softly upon the thatched roofs, and the church bell rang through the mist like the herald of a small miracle. Mankind had survived. For in the Middle Ages, survival was never a certainty. It was a long, quiet ritual of endurance. A war with no victory, only those steadfast enough to keep trembling without falling. The cold tested not only the flesh, but everything that made people human. Faith, kindness, and the fragile meaning of us. When the firewood ran low, they shared the embers. When a loaf of bread was down to its crust, they broke it in half. Not out of nobility, but from the deep knowing that survival could not be done alone. In the darkness of small huts, people leaned into each other for warmth, both in body and in the deeper ancient sense of the word to warm. Amid snow, fire, and the breath of animals, stories became the last form of fuel. On long, moonless nights they spoke of past summers, of lost kin, of the small miracle of finding dry wood beneath the snow. The teller, the listener, the one half asleep. Together they wove an invisible flame, one that even the frost could not extinguish. In the silence of a frozen world, human voices were proof that humanity still existed. Hunger, cold, sickness, and solitude. These wore down not only the body but the spirit. And yet, in their weakest moments, people drew closest. A hand extended, a candle shared, a prayer whispered, small gestures binding them together through the white night. And that, more than fire or bread, was why they survived, because of each other. The peasants understood that winter could never be conquered. They did not fight it. They passed through it, as one recites a mournful prayer, slowly, evenly, without hope of an ending, yet with faith in endurance itself. They accepted snow, accepted hunger, accepted that life was but a fragile light between two breaths of wind, and in that acceptance lay their strength. They did not seek distant hope, only a meal tonight, a hearth tonight, a story before sleep. Even in the noble halls, behind thick stone walls and eternal candlelight, people shivered. The medieval cold spared no one. It merely changed shape. For the poor, it howled through mud walls. For the rich, it lived in the loneliness of vast chambers. Everyone feared winter, yet each learned to make peace with that fear, through wine, through faith, through labour, or through silence. And when the thaw came, no one cheered. No one called it victory. They simply stepped outside, watched the water run again, and knew the worst was over. It was not joy they felt, but a quiet relief, the calm of those who had endured. A peasant once wrote in his diary, "When I hear the dripping from the roof, my heart feels warmer than any fire." The medieval winter, in the end, was not merely a tale of cold. It was a tale of humanity itself, small, frail, yet unbroken. Amid frost and hunger, they still sang, still wove, still loved, still believed. They turned endurance into habit, and habit into a philosophy of life. And as one nameless chronicler once wrote, "Death was always near, yet men still lived, because they knew how to keep each other warm." Perhaps that is the true nature of the medieval winter, not a war against nature, but the art of living within its cruelty, where every breath, every flame, every story was a quiet declaration that said, "We are still here." And so, through all the centuries since, amid snow and shadow, humankind has never forgotten how to keep one another warm. If the medieval winter has anything left to teach us, it is this. Human beings were never truly weak. We have only forgotten how to be patient. In that world of smoke, mud, and darkness, they had no electricity, no soft blankets, no medicine, and yet they lived. Not by conquering nature, but by learning to endure it together. They did not fight the cold, they listened to it, walked through it, and turned it into a rhythm of life. In every story we tell, from mud huts to frozen palaces, from the tolling of church bells to laughter by the fire, we find the same truth. People found meaning even in hardship. They did not ask when winter would end. They cared only for how to keep warmth alive in themselves and in one another. And in that simplicity they lived slower, deeper, more honestly than we do today. For in our modern world of light and noise, it is easy to forget. Warmth does not come from the heater, but from the human heart. Safety is not in having everything, but in sharing the little we have. The people of the Middle Ages survived not because they were stronger than us, but because they understood that fear, loneliness, and cold could all be softened by one another's presence. So when you feel tired, or lost in the long days of uncertainty, remember that there were once people who lived through centuries far colder, far darker, and still found ways to tell stories, to love, to laugh. Their winter tested the body, ours tests the soul. But the answer remains the same: hold on to each other and keep a small flame inside. For in the end, across all the centuries, one truth endures. Human beings survive not by fire alone, but by the warmth of kindness. And perhaps, when you understand that, you will see that our world today, with its blankets, its lights, and its peace, is the very miracle those medieval souls once dreamed of in the dark. Now you may close your eyes, let the story drift away, like the last breath of a winter long gone, a gentle reminder that we're still alive, and still warm enough to smile. Sleep well, dear friends, and may your dreams be warm tonight. From Medieval History Dreams,